December 17, 1944. A snow-covered field, 3 kilometers southwest of Aachen, Germany. Technical Sergeant Robert Harlan of the 991st Field Artillery Battalion crouched behind the steel hull of his M12 Gun Motor Carriage and checked his watch. 42 seconds had passed since the massive 155mm gun behind him had fired its last round. The crew was already closing the earth spade, the driver gunning the Continental radial engine to life. Harlan knew what was coming. Somewhere to the east, German sound-ranging equipment had triangulated their position the moment the gun fired. German counter-battery artillery would respond. The mathematics was simple and unforgiving. His crew had perhaps 1 minute, perhaps less, before high-explosive shells began falling on this exact spot. The M12 had just fired from a position nearly 18,000 meters behind the front lines. The massive shell, weighing 95 pounds, had arced through the freezing December sky at more than 700 meters per second, reaching a German artillery position that American forward observers had identified 20 minutes earlier. The shell's flight time was approximately 45 seconds. By the time it struck its target, Harlan's crew was supposed to be gone. This was the terrible calculus of modern artillery warfare. Fire from extreme range, relocate immediately, survive. The alternative was death. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M12 Gun Motor Carriage represented a paradox of American military engineering. It mounted a First World War-era French artillery piece, the 155mm GPF gun, onto the chassis of an obsolete M3 Grant medium tank. The result was a vehicle that could fire one of the heaviest shells in the American arsenal from positions so distant that enemy forces could not see it, could barely hear it, and had only seconds to respond before the American crew vanished into the landscape. The gun could destroy concrete fortifications 7 feet thick. It could demolish German Tiger tanks from ranges where the Tigers could not return fire. It could reach across nearly 12 miles of battlefield to strike ammunition dumps, command posts, and enemy artillery batteries. But the M12's greatest tactical advantage was not its range. It was mobility paired with devastating firepower. A towed artillery piece of equivalent caliber required 3 hours to unlimber, fire, limber up again, and relocate 6 miles to a new position. The M12 could accomplish the same task in 35 minutes. This difference, measured in minutes rather than hours, meant survival. German counter-battery doctrine in 1944 relied on sound-ranging microphone arrays and flash-spotting observation posts. These systems could locate an artillery position within 2 to 4 minutes of the first shot. Experienced German artillery officers could place counter-battery fire on that location within 5 to 7 minutes. An American crew firing a towed gun would still be preparing to move when the German shells arrived. An M12 crew would be gone. The irony was profound. American military planners had initially rejected the M12 design as unnecessary. The Army Ground Forces declared in October 1943 that it no longer needed self-propelled heavy artillery. 100 M12s had been manufactured between 1942 and 1943, then mothballed, sent to training depots, or simply stored in warehouses. The prevailing doctrine held that towed artillery, properly positioned and protected, would suffice. The self-propelled gun was expensive, mechanically complex, and used a chassis already obsolete by 1943 standards. Why waste resources on such a weapon when towed guns, already in inventory and well understood by American artillery officers, could perform the same mission? The Western Front in December 1944 existed in a state of calculated violence. American and British forces had landed at Normandy 6 months earlier and had fought their way across France at tremendous cost. The Wehrmacht had retreated but had not collapsed. German forces now defended their homeland's western border with desperation born of certainty that defeat meant Germany's destruction. The Siegfried Line, called the West Wall by the Germans, stretched hundreds of miles along Germany's frontier. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and interlocking fields of artillery fire made every mile of advance costly. Artillery dominated this battlefield. More soldiers died from artillery fire than from any other cause in World War II. The gun, not the rifle, not the tank, not the aircraft, was the true king of battle. Artillery could destroy fortifications, suppress enemy infantry, destroy armor, interdict supply lines, and most importantly, could kill enemy artillery before that artillery killed friendly forces. The side that controlled artillery dominated the battlefield. The side that lost its artillery lost the battle. American artillery doctrine in 1944 emphasized massed fires and rapid response. American forward observers, positioned with infantry units at the front lines, could call for artillery support and receive fire within 3 to 6 minutes. American artillery battalions could coordinate fires from dozens of guns simultaneously, placing hundreds of shells on a single target within seconds. This time-on-target fire mission, where shells from multiple batteries arrived simultaneously, regardless of the gun's varying distances from the target, was devastatingly effective. German forces learned to fear American artillery above almost all other weapons. American artillery killed more German soldiers than American infantry. But American artillery had a vulnerability. German forces possessed their own sophisticated artillery doctrine, one that emphasized counter-battery fire as the highest priority mission. German artillery reconnaissance units deployed sound-ranging equipment and flash-spotting posts to locate American guns. Once located, German artillery would mass fires to destroy the American battery. The Germans understood that destroying enemy artillery was more valuable than destroying enemy infantry. Kill the guns, and the infantry becomes vulnerable. German counter-battery doctrine was aggressive, sophisticated, and effective. Sound-ranging equipment used arrays of microphones placed in a geometric pattern across several kilometers of front. When an artillery piece fired, the sound wave reached each microphone at slightly different times. By measuring these time differences with precision, German technicians could calculate the artillery piece's location to within 100 meters. The equipment was mechanical, reliable, and required no visual observation. An artillery piece firing from behind a hill, concealed by fog, or positioned at night, would still be located. The microphones heard everything. Flash spotting used trained observers with surveying equipment positioned at multiple observation posts. When an artillery piece fired at night, the muzzle flash was visible for miles. Observers would note the bearing to the flash. By combining bearings from multiple observation posts, German officers could triangulate the artillery position. Flash spotting was less precise than sound ranging in daylight, but remained effective at night when American artillery often fired. The combination of sound ranging and flash spotting meant that any artillery piece that fired repeatedly from the same position would be located, targeted, and destroyed. The German response time was the critical factor. From the moment an American artillery piece fired its first round, German sound-ranging crews needed approximately 2 minutes to process the acoustic data and determine a firing position. German flash-spotting crews needed 3 to 4 minutes to coordinate observations and produce a location. Once the location was determined, German artillery officers needed another 2 to 3 minutes to compute firing data and transmit fire missions to their batteries. German gun crews needed 1 to 2 minutes to load and fire. The total time from American first shot to German counter-battery shells impacting the American position was 5 to 8 minutes under ideal conditions. Under combat conditions, with equipment damaged, communications disrupted, or crews exhausted, the time might extend to 10 or 12 minutes. But the response was inevitable. American artillery officers in 1943 understood the German counter-battery threat. The solution, according to established doctrine, was defensive positioning. Artillery batteries should be dug in, protected by earth berms, and positioned in locations difficult for enemy observers to see. Batteries should fire from prepared positions with overhead cover where possible. Guns should be dispersed to minimize losses from a single counter-battery strike. Most importantly, artillery should be positioned far enough behind the front lines that enemy artillery could not reach them. This defensive doctrine made logical sense. Artillery was valuable. Each gun represented significant industrial investment, required months of crew training, and consumed vast quantities of ammunition and fuel. Losing guns meant losing firepower. Protecting guns meant maintaining firepower. Therefore, artillery doctrine emphasized protection over mobility. Dig in, disperse, defend. This was the wisdom of military professionals who had studied artillery warfare for decades. Towed artillery fit this doctrine perfectly. A towed 155mm gun, once emplaced in a prepared position, was stable, accurate, and could fire for hours. The crew could construct protective berms, camouflage nets, and overhead cover. The gun could be positioned in a depression or behind a ridgeline where enemy observation was difficult. Supply trucks could bring ammunition forward along protected routes. The battery could establish a fire direction center with full communications to forward observers and higher headquarters. Everything about towed artillery encouraged static defensive positioning. The few American self-propelled artillery pieces in service before 1944 were light weapons. The M7 Priest, mounting a 105mm howitzer on a Sherman tank chassis, provided mobile fire support for armored divisions. But the M7 was designed for offensive operations, for keeping pace with advancing tanks, not for the grinding attritional warfare of the Western Front in winter. Heavier self-propelled guns existed in limited numbers, but were not considered essential. The Army had towed guns in abundance. Why complicate logistics and training with self-propelled variants? The M12 Gun Motor Carriage had been conceived in 1941, when the Ordnance Department proposed mounting heavy artillery on tracked chassis. The prototype T6 was tested in February 1942 at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The tests demonstrated remarkable performance. The self-propelled gun could fire, displace 6 miles, and fire again in 35 minutes. A towed gun of equivalent size required 3 hours for the same evolution. The difference was dramatic, but the Army Ground Forces, the command responsible for determining equipment requirements, was skeptical. The existing inventory of towed artillery worked adequately. The war was being won with conventional weapons. The M12 seemed a solution in search of a problem. 100 M12s were manufactured anyway, authorized before the Army Ground Forces' skepticism hardened into outright rejection. These vehicles were completed by March 1943, immediately relegated to training duties. Crews learned to operate them. Tactics were developed and discarded. The vehicles sat in depots. The war continued without them. By October 1943, the Army Ground Forces officially declared the M12 unnecessary and recommended no further production. The existing vehicles would serve out their useful life in training establishments and then be scrapped. The M12 appeared destined for a footnote in military history, a failed experiment, an interesting but ultimately useless weapon. This assessment would be reversed within 3 months. The reversal would be driven not by theoretical doctrine but by the brutal mathematics of survival on the battlefield. Those mathematics were about to become devastatingly clear. The decision to resurrect the M12 came in December 1943 during planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff was conducting detailed assessments of equipment requirements for the assault and subsequent campaign across France. Artillery officers examined the expected battlefield conditions. German defensive positions along the Atlantic Wall were massively fortified. Concrete bunkers with walls 6 to 8 feet thick protected German artillery, machine guns, and observation posts. Standard American artillery, firing high-explosive shells, could damage but not reliably destroy such fortifications. Direct fire from tanks and tank destroyers could penetrate concrete at close range, but getting tanks close to bunkers meant exposing them to German anti-tank guns. A different solution was needed. The M12's 155mm gun could fire armor-piercing ammunition with a delayed fuse, allowing the shell to penetrate deep into concrete before detonating. Tests conducted in early 1944 demonstrated that the M12 could penetrate 7 feet of reinforced concrete when firing from ranges between 2,000 and 4,000 yards. Below 2,000 yards, the shell's velocity was too high, and the projectile would disintegrate on impact. Above 4,000 yards, the shell lacked sufficient energy for reliable penetration, but within that window, the M12 was devastatingly effective against fortifications. Moreover, The M12 could conduct these direct fire missions and then withdraw before German forces could respond effectively. 74 M12s were selected from storage, transported to Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, and completely refurbished. The refurbishment went far beyond routine maintenance. Engineers examined every vehicle and identified weaknesses discovered during 2 years of training use. The original M3 Grant chassis bogies were replaced with improved M4 Sherman-style bogies that provided better weight distribution and reliability. A gun shield was added to protect the crew during direct fire missions. Communications equipment was upgraded, engines were rebuilt or replaced. The hydraulic recoil spade system was overhauled. Each vehicle was essentially rebuilt from the tracks up. The refurbished M12s were organized into 5 field artillery battalions. The 258th, 557th, 558th, 987th, and 991st. Each battalion received 14 or 15 M12s, organized into batteries of 4 to 5 vehicles each. Accompanying each M12 was an M30 cargo carrier, a vehicle built on the same chassis as the M12 but without the gun. The M30 carried 40 rounds of 155mm ammunition, plus the other half of the 12-man crew that operated the gun. The M12 itself could carry only 10 rounds in its limited internal storage. Crews for these battalions were selected from existing artillery units and underwent intensive training. Operating the M12 required different skills than operating towed artillery. The driver had to maneuver a 26-ton vehicle across difficult terrain, while the commander navigated and communicated with forward observers and higher headquarters. The gun crew had to load and fire the massive 95-pound shells while standing on an open platform at the rear of a moving vehicle. The entire crew had to coordinate fire missions, displacement, and resupply while under combat conditions. Training emphasized speed, load, fire, displace, reload. Every second counted. The 155mm gun itself was a weapon from another era. The M1000, 918, and M1918 M1 variants mounted on the M12 were American-manufactured versions of the French cannon de 55 Grande Puissance Filou, designed during World War I by Colonel Louis Filou of the French Army. The gun had proven itself in the trenches of the Western Front between 1914 and 1918. French artillery had destroyed German fortifications, shattered infantry attacks, and dominated no man's land with this weapon. The Americans had adopted it because it worked. By 1944, the gun was technically obsolete, but obsolete did not mean ineffective. The M1918 gun fired a separate loading round, meaning the shell and propellant charge were loaded separately. This made handling easier but slowed the rate of fire. An experienced crew could fire 4 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Under combat conditions, with the crew fatigued, the vehicle moving, or ammunition supply disrupted, the rate dropped to 2 or 3 rounds per minute. The gun's maximum elevation was 30 degrees, limiting its ability to fire in high-angle trajectories over nearby terrain. The traverse was only 14 degrees left or right, meaning the entire vehicle had to be repositioned to engage targets outside that narrow arc. These limitations were accepted because the gun's range and hitting power were exceptional. The M12 battalions arrived in France in July 1944, 1 month after D-Day. The 557th and 558th Field Artillery Battalions landed at Utah Beach and moved inland to support 7 Corps. The 258th Field Artillery Battalion landed at Omaha Beach and was assigned to support operations against the fortress city of Brest. The 987th and 991st Battalions arrived in August and were immediately thrust into the breakout battles across France. The baptism of fire came at Brest, a heavily fortified French port city that the Germans had converted into a fortress. The German garrison, commanded by General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, consisted of nearly 40,000 troops supported by extensive concrete fortifications, coastal artillery, and naval guns. American forces besieging Brest included the 2nd, 8th, and 29th Infantry Divisions, but progress was measured in yards per day. German bunkers dominated every approach. American infantry assaulted these positions repeatedly, suffering severe casualties. Towed artillery hammered the fortifications with high-explosive shells, but achieved little effect. The concrete was too thick. The 258th Field Artillery Battalion was ordered forward to conduct direct fire missions against the bunkers. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford Butler commanded the battalion and personally supervised the first engagements. The M12s would move into position at dawn. When visibility was poor and German observation was limited, forward observers would identify specific bunkers that were blocking infantry advances. The M12s would fire armor-piercing shells with concrete-piercing fuses at ranges between 2,000 and 3,500 yards. After firing 3 to 5 rounds per target, the M12s would withdraw before German artillery could respond. The results exceeded expectations. Butler's after-action report, filed in September 1944, documented 43 pillboxes attacked by the battalion's M12s. All 43 showed evidence of penetration. Bunkers that had withstood weeks of bombardment by high-explosive artillery were destroyed in minutes by armor-piercing direct fire. German infantry, sheltering inside what they believed were impregnable fortifications, died when shells penetrated the concrete and detonated inside. The psychological effect on the surviving German defenders was profound. Fortifications they trusted were no longer safe. Colonel Otto Ellis, executive officer of the 30th Division Artillery, observed M12 operations near the Siegfried Line and filed his own assessment. Using the 155mm self-propelled gun at ranges between 2,000 and 4,000 yards, penetration is secured. Under 2,000 yards, the projectile disintegrates upon striking the concrete surface. Above 2,000 yards, using the concrete-piercing fuse with 3 to 5 rounds, we have penetrated 6 feet of reinforced concrete. Ellis's report was circulated to artillery commands across the European theater. The M12 had found its purpose, but direct fire against fortifications, while dramatic, was not the M12's most important contribution. The true value emerged during mobile operations as American forces broke out from Normandy and raced across France. The 991st Field Artillery Battalion was attached to the 3rd Armored Division in August 1944. The 3rd Armored, commanded by Major General Maurice Rose, was one of the fastest-moving American divisions in Europe. Rose's tanks advanced so rapidly that supply lines struggled to keep up. Infantry lagged behind. Most artillery could not maintain the pace. Towed artillery battalions would establish firing positions, support the advance for several hours, then spend 3 or 4 hours displacing forward to new positions. By the time they were ready to fire again, the tanks had moved beyond their range. The 991st Field Artillery Battalion could keep up. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Soffer commanded the battalion and coordinated directly with Rose's headquarters. When the 3rd Armored encountered German resistance, the M12s would deploy, deliver massed fires, then displace forward to remain within range. The M12s fired counter-battery missions against German artillery that was trying to slow the American advance. They fired interdiction missions against German supply columns and reserves moving to the front. They provided fire support during river crossings, urban assaults, and meeting engagements. The battalion became the 3rd Armored Division's primary heavy artillery. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On August 17, 1944, during the Battle of the Falaise Argentan Gap, the 991st fired 1,073 rounds in a single day against German panzer formations, attempting to escape encirclement. The M12s displaced 6 times during that day, moving from position to maintain firing range and avoid German counter-battery fire. German artillery attempted to locate and destroy the American guns but consistently arrived minutes too late. The M12s were gone. The fundamental transformation in American artillery doctrine occurred not through theoretical debate, but through observed survival rates. By September 1944, artillery officers across the European theater were comparing casualty statistics between units equipped with M12s and units equipped with towed artillery. The disparity was striking. Artillery battalions operating towed 155mm guns were suffering casualties from German counter-battery fire at rates 3 to 4 times higher than M12-equipped battalions. The reason was simple. German counter-battery doctrine worked. Sound ranging and flash spotting were effective. German artillery could locate American guns and deliver accurate fire. The American guns that survived were the guns that moved. Captain James Benson, serving as a forward observer with the 987th Field Artillery Battalion, described the tactical dynamic in a letter home in October 1944. "The Germans are very good at finding our guns. They have listening devices that pick up the sound of our artillery and calculate where we are firing from. Within 5 or 6 minutes of our first shot, German shells start landing on our position. But we are not there anymore. The M12 fires, we pull back the spade, the driver starts the engine, and we are moving before the German shells arrive. Towed guns cannot do this. The men with towed guns dig holes and pray. We drive away." The 991st Field Artillery Battalion achieved a particular distinction in early September 1944. Operating with the 3rd Armored Division during the drive toward Aachen, the battalion became the first American artillery unit from the Western Front to fire on German soil. The target was a road junction near Bildchen, southwest of Aachen. At a range of 19,800 yards, nearly 11¼ miles. The fire mission was conducted from positions inside Belgium. The M12s fired, displaced, and relocated across the German border, continuing to support the advance. German attempts to locate and destroy the battery failed. The guns were moving targets, and moving targets were difficult to kill. Between September and December 1944, the 5 M12 battalions fired more than 150,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition. They conducted counter-battery missions, destroyed fortifications, interdicted German supply lines, and provided fire support for infantry and armor. Battalion commanders filed detailed after-action reports documenting missions, expenditures, and losses. The reports revealed a pattern. M12 battalions suffered mechanical breakdowns, supply problems, and occasional losses to direct German assault. But they suffered minimal casualties from counter-battery fire. The mobility advantage was keeping crews alive. The clearest demonstration came during the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944. The operation Americans called the Battle of the Bulge. German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, attempting to split American and British forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The attack achieved initial success through surprise and overwhelming local superiority. American units were surrounded, overrun, or forced to retreat. Artillery units, particularly towed artillery battalions, faced a terrible choice: stand and fight from prepared positions, or abandon their guns and retreat. Many chose to fight and were destroyed. German forces captured dozens of American artillery pieces during the first days of the offensive. The M12 battalions did not face this choice. They could fight and withdraw simultaneously. The 557th and 558th Field Artillery Battalions provided fire support for retreating American infantry, then displaced westward ahead of the German advance. They established new firing positions, engaged German spearheads, then displaced again. The pattern repeated for days. German forces never captured an M12 during the entire Ardennes campaign. The guns were too mobile to be caught. By late December 1944, when American forces had stabilized the front and begun counterattacking, artillery officers throughout the European theater were submitting requests for additional M12s or equivalent self-propelled heavy artillery. The lesson was clear: static artillery doctrine, based on defensive positioning and prepared emplacements, resulted in high casualties when facing competent counter-battery capabilities. Mobile artillery doctrine, based on rapid displacement and avoiding counterfire, resulted in survival. The difference was not theoretical. It was measured in dead artillerymen and destroyed guns. The evidence was undeniable. The M12 Gun Motor Carriage served through the final months of the European War, with distinction that vindicated every decision to resurrect the weapon from obscurity. The 5 field artillery battalions, equipped with M12s, participated in every major American offensive from the Ardennes counterattack in January 1945, through the crossing of the Rhine in March, and the final drive into Germany in April and May. The 991st Field Artillery Battalion, still attached to the 3rd Armored Division, fired the final counter-battery mission of its war on May 7, 1945, against German artillery positions defending a bridge over the Elbe River. The German guns fell silent. Hours later, Germany surrendered. The statistical record of M12 operations compiled by the Army's Ordnance Department revealed performance that exceeded all pre-war expectations. The 74 M12s deployed to Europe fired more than 250,000 rounds during 11 months of combat. This represented an average of more than 3,300 rounds per vehicle, an extraordinary number given that each M12 could carry only 10 rounds internally. The support provided by M30 cargo carriers and supply echelons had maintained a sustained rate of fire that proved the concept of mobile heavy artillery was not merely viable, but superior to static alternatives under the conditions of modern warfare. Mechanical reliability statistics told another story about the M12's success. The vehicles were built on M3 ground chassis that were already considered obsolete by 1943 standards. The Continental radial engines were the same engines that powered thousands of Sherman tanks, proven but not exceptional. The automotive components were standard pre-war designs. Yet the M12s maintained operational readiness rates above 75% throughout the campaign. Comparable to purpose-built modern self-propelled guns, when mechanical failures occurred, they were primarily related to the immense stresses of firing the 155mm gun repeatedly, not to fundamental design flaws. The chassis performed its task adequately. Combat loss statistics were the most telling measure of the M12's tactical effectiveness. Of the 74 M12s deployed to Europe, only 2 were destroyed by enemy action during the entire campaign. Both losses occurred when German forces overran American positions during the initial days of the Ardennes offensive. The crews had insufficient warning to withdraw. In both cases, the crews survived by abandoning their vehicles. Not a single M12 was destroyed by German counter-battery fire during 11 months of combat operations. This was an extraordinary survival rate for heavy artillery operating in an environment where German counter-battery capabilities remained effective throughout the war. Personnel casualties among M12 crews were similarly low, compared to towed artillery units. The 5 M12 battalions suffered fewer than 50 killed in action during the entire European campaign. The majority of these casualties occurred during direct infantry assaults on M12 positions, not from counter-battery fire. By contrast, towed 155mm gun battalions operating in the same theaters during the same period suffered casualty rates 3 to 4 times higher. The difference was directly attributable to mobility. Crews that could move survived. Crews that remained static died. The tactical lessons learned from M12 operations were documented in numerous after-action reports, training bulletins, and doctrinal revisions issued by the Army Ground Forces and the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. These documents circulated throughout the artillery community and influenced planning for future weapons development. The central lesson was unambiguous. Self-propelled heavy artillery with sufficient mobility to conduct shoot and scoot operations possessed decisive tactical advantages over towed artillery in any environment where the enemy possessed effective counter-battery capabilities. This lesson would shape American artillery development for decades. The broader implications extended beyond artillery tactics. The M12's success demonstrated that mobility was not merely an offensive advantage but a defensive necessity. The ability to move quickly after firing was the difference between survival and destruction. This principle applied to all indirect fire weapons, artillery, mortars, rockets, and later, missiles. Any weapon system that revealed its position by firing needed the capability to relocate before the enemy could respond. This became a foundational principle of modern warfare, validated first by the M12's combat record in 1944 and 45. In May 1945, as American forces occupied Germany and the war in Europe concluded, the Army conducted a comprehensive evaluation of all weapons systems employed during the campaign. The M12 Gun Motor Carriage received high marks for effectiveness, but was simultaneously declared obsolete. This apparent contradiction reflected the weapon's unique position in American military history. The M12 had proven the concept of mobile heavy artillery conclusively, but the execution was acknowledged as improvised and temporary. The chassis was obsolete. The gun was a World War I design. The entire vehicle represented a stopgap solution to an immediate problem rather than a purpose-designed weapon system. Development of the M12's replacement had actually begun in 1944, even as the M12 battalions were proving themselves in combat. The M40 Gun Motor Carriage mounted a newer 155mm gun, the M1 Long Tom, on a chassis based on the M4, a 3 Sherman tank. The 45 seconds referenced in this story's title represents the approximate time between an M12 firing its 155mm gun and the shell impacting a target at maximum range. During those 45 seconds, the shell arced through the sky at supersonic velocity, traveled nearly 12 miles, and delivered 95 pounds of high explosive or armor-piercing capability against targets the crew might never see. During those same 45 seconds, German sound-ranging equipment was processing acoustic data, calculating the gun's position, and preparing fire missions. The race between projectile flight time and counter-battery response time defined the tactical calculus. The M12 crews understood they had perhaps 1 minute, perhaps slightly more, before German shells arrived. Every second spent at the firing position increased risk. Speed was survival. The technical specifications that made this survival possible were unremarkable individually, but decisive in combination. The Continental radial engine could propel the 26-ton vehicle at 24 miles per hour on roads, fast enough to relocate several miles between firing positions. The gun's 18,000-meter maximum range allowed firing from positions beyond the reach of most German artillery. The crew's training emphasized rapid emplacement and displacement, reducing the time spent vulnerable. None of these capabilities was extraordinary by engineering standards, but together they created a weapon system that could dominate the battlefield and survive. The cost of learning these lessons was measured in the lives of artillerymen who served in towed gun battalions before the M12's value was recognized. Hundreds of American soldiers died manning guns that could not move quickly enough to evade German counter-battery fire. These men performed their duties with courage and professionalism, but courage could not compensate for immobility. They died because doctrine had not yet caught up with battlefield reality. The M12 crews who survived did so partly through skill and partly through the advantage of equipment that doctrine initially deemed unnecessary. The M12 Gun Motor Carriage occupies a modest place in military history, overshadowed by more famous weapons and dramatic campaigns. Yet its story illuminates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. The side that can strike and withdraw survives, while the side that must remain static to fight faces destruction. This principle applies to artillery, to tanks, to aircraft, to missile systems, to every weapons platform that reveals its position by engaging the enemy. Mobility is not merely an offensive advantage, it is the essential defensive characteristic that allows continued operations. The M12 proved this principle in the winter of 1944, firing from positions German forces could locate but could not reach in time to destroy. The preserved M12 at Fort Sill stands as a monument to this lesson. Visitors who examine the vehicle see the massive 155mm gun, the open crew compartment, the earth spade at the rear, the worn tracks and road wheels. What they cannot see from static display is the weapon's true capability. The ability to appear, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before the enemy could respond. That capability, proven by 74 vehicles and approximately 600 men during 11 months of combat, transformed American artillery doctrine, and saved countless lives in subsequent conflicts. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.